What the UFO? I'm Caleb. If you're enjoying the show and you're finding some value here or having a little bit of fun, please support us on patreon.com/WTUFO. We're only looking for $1 a month. If that's too much, we totally understand. Please do not support us. But if $1 a month right now is easy for you, please sign up to be a supporting member. It'll really help the show a lot, and we deeply appreciate it. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/WTUFO. What the UFO? I'm Caleb. I'm here today with Michael Glawson. He's a philosopher and the host of the Anomalous Review podcast and the co-host of the UAP Studies podcast. And he is a contributing member of SCU, which is the Scientific Coalition for UAP Studies. Hi, Michael. Great to meet you.
Great to be here, man.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us. I want to say right off the bat, I think the UAP Studies podcast is excellent. And Michael's new podcast, Anomalous Review, is arguably even better. It's a really, really great, dialed in, highly technical and competent pod, and you're talking to people at the very top of the field. I'm extremely impressed so far, and I would recommend that everybody please go listen to it immediately.
Oh, that's nice of you. Thank you. It tends to be a little drier than your podcast or UAP studies, but if you feel like you've already made the rounds on most of the UAP podcasts, give it a try.
Yeah, strong recommend from here. Also, extremely impressed that you got Christopher Mellon to talk to you, because she doesn't go around talking to people.
It doesn't. No, he's actually. I texted with Chris Mellon a few times and felt like this is not a place I expected to be in life. Texting with Chris Mellon, but there it is.
That's great. Well, let's follow that transition into what has your life been like. What can you tell us a little bit about your academic background and or any personal background details you might like to involve?
Sure. So I'm a philosopher, which is an absurd sounding thing to say. I have the dual challenge of telling people I'm a philosopher who works on UFOs, because what the hell is that? But I have a PhD in philosophy, which I got because before that I was studying theology, and at the end of my theology degree, two of my mentors sat me down and were like, you really need to switch careers, because you're going to get fired from every job that you ever get in the world of religion.
Wow, that's some real talk.
It was true. And they had both, I didn't want to be a pastor or whatever. I didn't really know what I wanted to be. I knew I loved theology. I thought it was a fascinating subject. And I just got a degree in it. And the only jobs really available for it are you can be a professor of theology, which you can't do with just the degree that I was getting, or you can be a pastor. And they were like, you cannot be a pastor. They had been pastors, and they were like, you're going to get fired about every job. So
because you tell it how it is.
I mean, maybe I'd like to think that's it, but I think their concern is the fact that people who run religious congregations have to deal with so much political infighting that I'm not constitutionally prepared for. That they were absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing harsh or really especially painful about this, but they were right that it's just not a job that was right for me. But they said, you really seem to like philosophy. A lot of your interests in theology are philosophical in nature. Why don't you just apply to philosophy grad schools? Which I hadn't considered doing, but I needed to do something after college. So I did that, and I got into a few, and I ended up studying philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, kind of. I found a interesting overlap in those around philosophy of technology, and particularly the ethical consequences of our use and adoption and development of certain technologies. And that became kind of my thing, mixing all those things in, maybe some philosophy of religion, mysticism, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science stuff, kind of all coalesced into a project. And then I started teaching philosophy. I taught it while I was doing my PhD, and then I taught afterwards at Georgia State, and then I moved to College of Charleston to teach here, and then the pandemic hit, and I quit teaching because it became unbearable for everybody. And during that interim, where I was just kind of sitting by my pool reading books, I got this catalog from Oxford University Press. When you're a professor, all of these presses send you catalogs in hopes that you will assign these books to your students. And so they'll send you what are called review copies. for free. You
Hmm.
just want a copy to look over and see if it's something you want to adopt. And so I'm thumbing through Oxford University Press, and I see this book on UFOs, Technology, and Religion by Diana Walsh Pasulka called
Hmm.
American Cosmic. And I was like, Oxford published a book about UFOs? Like, please send me that. I mean, I had no real use for it in a class, but teachers all the time are just like seeing books that they think are interesting and asking for review copies. So I just asked for one. And I sort of expected it to be about like UFO cults or something, which could be
Hmm.
interesting. And it wasn't. For everybody who hasn't read the book yet, spoiler alert, American Cosmic is like, UFOs are a real thing. There's really good evidence for it. There's people in the military industrial complex and government and the science world who take it totally seriously and are baffled by it, and it transforms their life. And I was just like blown away by the existence of this book. And then I just started highlighting books in the bibliography and reading those, and it is a rabbit hole I have not found my way back out of yet. But I never hoped to call myself a UFO person. If 8 years ago somebody had told me that, I would have been really upset at the fact that I was ever going to have to tell people that. But no offense, but I mean, we all understand it's not. Nobody who's trying to make friends quickly tells them, "Well, I'm into UFOs."
Yeah,
So,
and trying not to strain their current friendships.
yes, right.
Hmm.
So yeah, so it's kind of how I got into it. But before college, I was a musician. I played drums and did some recording stuff, and that that was a cool life. But I liked books better for some reason.
Mm. Wow, that's cool. It does sound like you studied the 7 perfect things to get really into UFOs. Philosophy of mind, theology, philosophy of science. It all just like coalesces around this one fascinating topic.
It does.
The nuts and the bolts and whatever you call the other half of this subject, the high strangeness, I guess. Like you, I'm pretty new to this. 5 years ago, I just thought they were a fun sci-fi idea, basically. And it was really only 2 years ago, even after all the Leslie Kane, Ralph Blumenthal stuff, even after the videos, for some reason, it never fully gelled for me. And then the trigger point for me was listening to David Fravor explain patiently and thoroughly the Tic Tac incident. And it's just like full light bulb went off in this basement where all this stuff was already stored. That it might actually be real, and then since then it's felt like the most interesting subject in the universe. Have you had that feeling?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, not because it in itself is that interesting to me. I mean, the UFOs objects or the UAP phenomena are themselves fascinating. The things that you see in reports, but it's the implications that I think drag me in. Like, if to whatever degree this is real, the implications for all the other stuff that we really care about are vast and worth exploring. And that's what I really want to explore.
Same. I shouldn't talk too much about myself, but I will also
No,
say
please do. I want to get to know you.
Well, same. I'm interested in futurism, and I sometimes do acting work in that direction, like imagining what a character would be like from 100 years in the future. And when I bumped into the UFO thing, it like radically derailed my futurism project, because imagining what 100 years from now might be like is completely different. If we think in 20, 40, or 5 years, we're gonna suddenly have access to, what people call Clark tech, like highly advanced sci-fi like ability.
Magic, basically.
Yeah. I've been thinking about that word magic, and I was listening to your interview with Gary Nolan yesterday, and I was just thinking about how magic is that thing that's always just outside the realm of our ability to explain. People have kind of said this thing about AI, like, oh, real intelligence is just the stuff we don't understand yet. Like as soon as it can beat us at chess, we say, well, chess isn't intelligence. And as soon as we describe a phenomenon, we say, well, that's not magic anymore, because we get it. So we always say like magic isn't real, but it's outside. It's just like whatever we haven't explained yet. And there's all this interesting stuff around psi phenomena that I'm sure, bumped into as well. And
oh, definitely.
that's a fascinating side bunny hole. But I've heard you mention that a part of the UFO topic is that it touches a bunch of other really interesting, really weird, really challenging subjects. And I wonder if you've had this feeling exploring it, that you intuitively want to kind of bracket off these side subjects and say, okay, well, that's a bridge too far. But then you repeatedly kind of find yourself in these situations where something that you had previously thought was silly turns out to be well researched, like, I don't know, Dean Radin's work on precognition.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, I do have that experience. I remember at one point, right when I got into this, I think one of the next books I read after Diana Walsh Pasuka's book was Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée.
Mm-hmm.
And I read a lot at night from like midnight to about 3:30 in the morning, I'm reading every night.
The witching hour.
The witching hour. And so my partner is in bed with me, and I'm just reading, and she'll snore away. But she tells the story about it, how when I was getting into this at one point, I'm reading next to her, and she's just awoken by me saying like, "Oh, we've got leprechauns," like the because I was struggling with that very thing of like, okay, UFOs are real. Like, what else is real that I didn't think was serious? Like, where does it stop? Is it Bigfoot? Like,
Yeah.
I've never found Bigfoot that interesting, but I'm okay with like some hominid walking around in the Pacific Northwest that we haven't documented. You know, that's interesting, but like not metaphysically, groundbreaking discovery or something. But yeah, it's like, oh, leprechauns now are a thing that, and for those listening, like the actual sort of fairy faith account of leprechauns is nothing like you see in Hollywood. It's just completely different thing. But yeah, like fairy lore, there seems to be some sort of genuine evidence that there were encounters that underlie a lot of the fairy lore of the British Isles and whatnot. But I don't know where to draw the line, and I really like being able to not freak out about the fact that this kind of branches off into all these other areas. But it is emotionally unsettling to know that you don't know what to call silliness anymore, because you find, but this is the thing that happens in philosophy. And you go into philosophy, like if you go to grad school, you go in thinking that you've got a framework, you understand reality, and basically you're just working on the details or something.
Okay.
And then you encounter super duper smart people who believe things that at first sound utterly ridiculous to you. I mean, just off the wall stupid. And then if you are constitutionally well equipped to do philosophy, you sit down with them and you patiently let them explain their view. And at the end, you come out thinking, "Oh no, that I see why you think that." And so, learning philosophy is really a years long process of coming to believe silly things are not silly. Like, to give you an example, about my second year in grad school, I took a philosophy of physics class with one of the most insanely intelligent people I've ever known, named Michael Dixon. He's just a marvelous thinker. And he was telling me how his mentor, a guy named Bos von Frosten at Notre Dame, who's a physicist and philosopher, doesn't believe electrons are real. And I thought, that's stupid. It's just nonsense. Like, how could you possibly believe that? And after about an hour and a half talking to him, and still to this day, I'm now like an electron skeptic. I mean, they're useful explanatory concepts. We've built tools that respond to these concepts in certain ways and that embody the idea of an electron. But the question of whether there's like an actual thing that fits this description that we've come up with, I'm kind of agnostic about. I'm not really sure. But that to me seemed like an insane position.
Yeah.
Compared to now years of thinking about it. Now I know it's not. So you learn eventually that your sense of what's sane or insane or silly or not is not really very trustworthy. Like, you still have that voice in your head that's like, oh, that's silly. But you learn to say, just be quiet for a little. Like, I've registered that you think it's silly, voice in my head, but we're gonna look into it. And a lot of silly stuff does turn out to be silly, but then you find that there's like one core ingredient of it that you're like, that's not silly though. That one thing right there isn't. But you have to listen closely and like be thoughtful enough about it. And you find out that UFOs are like that. Tons and tons of stuff about UFOs is just garbage thought. It's just lazy, wild speculation. But some small percentage of it is coming from people who aren't doing that. And once you find them and you hone in on it, you find that there's something really fascinating there.
To this point, one of the things I found really striking about the subject is just how much it turns out our epistemological understanding of the world is founded on kind of group expectations that are a lot softer than we think. Like, for example, electrons. I would have assumed as a layperson that we had a ton of great, like, indisputable sensor data that suggested these things are 100% real. And in fact, maybe we're just coasting on collective expectations about a sort of conceptual framework that has been very useful in terms of describing reality so far.
Yeah, well, just in the electron case, because I bet there's a bunch of physics nerds who are now having the experience that I had and thinking this person doesn't know what the hell they're talking about. Like, electrons are absolutely real, which I don't want people to cut off your podcast just because they think I'm stupid. But and the way it would work is that our collective expectations aren't the only thing that are in play. It's we start building machines that have expectations, and right machines are built to detect certain like windows of phenomena. And we assume that anything that pops up in that window of phenomena is confirmation that the theoretical entity that we base the design of the machine on must actually be real. But you can, and this is something that can mathematically be proven, you can create a totally consistent theory of physics that explains every observation we've ever made, but without ever appealing to the existence of an electron. That's absolutely possible. We could have gotten exactly where we are in the world today, all the technology, everything that you see around here, without ever employing the idea of an electron. That doesn't mean they're not real, but it means that what works in science is not a function of reality or its ability to approximate reality, right? Like Newton was just wrong about pretty much everything that he said about the fundamental nature of physics and mechanics of motion. But we can use Newtonian physics to get us to the moon. We can be very precise with it. Same thing with like these, epicyclical maps of how the celestial bodies move before we, decided that or figured out that the sun is in the center of the solar system. And we had these, maps that put Earth at the center and then everything's kind of moving around in loops. Those maps work perfectly well to predict the movement of celestial bodies. You can predict eclipses and tell exactly where everything's going to be whenever it's going to be there. But they're totally wrong. And we know that they're wrong now because we can like just zoom out and look at from kind of above the plane of the solar system and see how things are moving relative to one another. But it didn't matter that they were wrong. Like, so it's not just that we have these collective expectations that we are kind of getting some confirmation bias out of when we observe the world. It's much more interesting and stronger than that. It's that really wrong models of reality can be extraordinarily effective and useful. And that just throws a wrench into everything when you start asking, well, everything, at least when you're taking science to be a tool for finding out the fundamental nature of things. It's really not that simple. Science is more like a tool that's useful for getting practical projects completed. But if it might not tell you, whether there's a soul or whatever, those like fundamental existential questions that like Neil deGrasse Tyson likes to say that science is eventually going to hone in on. I don't think it ever will.
Interesting. That also kind of pointed up the difference between science and engineering there, but maybe there's kind of like a three-part model that you proposed. There are the questions of the soul, or maybe sort of a philosophical domain still. Then there's science, you're learning about how the world works, and engineering is actually putting it into practice. And from the engineering perspective, it doesn't necessarily matter whether electrons are real. It matters whether
rockets go. No, it doesn't at all. Yeah, that's exactly right. And we tend to think that like, science can't answer philosophical questions. That's probably true. But philosophy can answer scientific questions really well. Like we now know that like everybody who has heard the story of like Galileo proving that heavier objects fall at the same rate as lighter objects. Everybody hears the story that Galileo did that by dropping different weighted balls off the Tower of Pisa. And he's got all sorts of experiments that he describes in his notebooks. Historians of science now know Galileo didn't do any of those experiments. Never ran any of them.
Fascinating.
but he was right. And how was he right? Well, he had these other proofs in his head, and they were just pure philosophical proofs. Like he says, here, I'm really going to prove to you that gravitation affects objects of different weights equally. Imagine that you take a heavy ball and a light ball and you tie them together and drop them off the Tower of Pisa. Do they now fall faster because of the combination of their weight? Or do they fall slower because the lighter ball is dragging the heavier ball? It should be both. So you get this contradiction. And so it can't be that heavy objects and light objects fall at different rates. It has to be that they fall the same. And that was a pure like armchair philosophy proof that actually did prove it, whereas the observational proof can't do it. Wow. So this relationship between science and philosophy and engineering is just really gnarly and complicated. But a lot of scientists don't know that because scientists don't study science. Scientists study things like quarks. And that's very different from science. Science is a human practice.
So are there meta scientists who are
philosophers
out there
of science?
Philosophers of science, okay.
And sociologists of science and historians of science. So philosophers of science study the conceptual bones and muscles of the scientific work. Sociologists of science study like how science is actually instantiated in a society, how we practice it versus how Chinese scientists practice it versus how it was practiced in the 1700s in Europe. And then the historians of science try to weave together some narrative that pulls in all the influences, because it's not just like people in a lab that are really influencing everything. It's like money, funding sources, it's religion, it's all sorts of things. So those are the people who really understand science as a practice, whereas scientists are the people who understand fairly well the thing that they're looking at, the machine or the animal or whatever it is that they're studying.
Yeah, that bounces me toward some interesting questions about expectations around science. I think another thing that happened to me as a layman coming into this was the shattering of assumption that we had looked into UAP. And I think a lot of people assume that we have, and that accounts for the lack of interest in the scientific community, that we must have checked it out and found that there was nothing there. But not having in-depth research about something is not the same as having a strong reason to believe it doesn't exist. So there's this way in which our ignorance is standing in for a negative certainty that is still kind of a block on public perception of this subject. Does that sound right to you?
That does sound right. And that's kind of the assumption that I brought in to the subject. Well, I didn't bring it in. That's the assumption that sort of undergirded all my previous encounters with even the word UAP. Was like, if there were a there, we would know, and it would just be all over the place. There wouldn't be any question if there were evidence for this. And maybe the thing that made me open initially to like considering these things, the first time I read the first UFO book about it, was the fact that I knew on some level that's just not how science works. There can be really good evidence for a thing that gets totally ignored simply because everybody's busy doing their own scientific projects and nobody wants to take this on, and there's not funding for it, or it's taboo. I mean, think about how long it took us to scientifically understand human sexuality at all. I mean, when Kinsey started studying sexuality in the 60s, there were people who thought that like oral sex made you like unable to conceive a child. Like, there was like a widespread belief among people.
Wow.
Well, you would think if there were evidence that weren't true, we would all know. How could this belief be so widespread if there were evidence for it? Well, it was just taboo to study human sexuality, so nobody did it. And everybody who could have done it was already involved in other projects. I think UFOs are a lot like that. There are a lot of scientists who, if you showed them the evidence that was there, would be fascinated by it. But not a lot of them would switch to pick up this as their research topic, because when you're a working scientist, your next like 5 years of your life are already planned out. You've already got grants, and you've got milestones that you've got to hit, and you've got to figure out a new research project before that one stops. And so it's not easy to like suddenly get a bunch of scientists to like veer off their current path and hone in on this, even if the evidence is great. It really has to be like in their extracurricular activity, or you need people who have an insane degree of academic credibility and freedom that they can just start doing this. Gary Nolan is an example of such a person.
And Avi Loeb, yeah.
Yeah, they're both tenured. They're both
Mm,
so successful and well known already. They don't have a ton to lose. They're not No grant's going to get pulled from them. They're both independently wealthy.
that
You
helps.
know, yeah, it does. I mean, I think Gary Null has 50 patents and like runs several companies and sold a few of them on like the Nasdaq. It's just he's fine, and he can do this stuff. The number of people who have the skill to study this, but who are in that position, is so vanishingly small. I mean, I doubt there's 50 such people in America. So that's how a topic can go uninvestigated publicly for a really, really long time, even if the evidence is glaring. It's Science is not just this panopticon that watches all of reality and waits for anything interesting to pop up and immediately assigns people to do it.
Mhm.
The Vatican does that.
Hmm.
Organizations like that can do that. And the Vatican has been studying UFOs much longer than the American scientific establishment has.
Hmm.
But they're also not a public institution the same way. They don't feel
Hmm.
that they owe the public anything in particular when it comes to like their scientific knowledge, unless it
Hmm.
can, definitely cure disease or something.
Yeah, the
But yeah,
CIA and remote viewing comes to mind there too. Like, yeah, they're going to
sure,
research it because it might have utility as spycraft, but they're not going to publish those papers.
absolutely, yeah. And this is where you start sounding a little bit conspiratorial because you are kind of
Hmm.
veering into the point where you say, well, there is knowledge that's been withheld from the public, but that's not conspiratorial thinking. That's just the nature of these organizations. I
Hmm.
mean, Lockheed Martin doesn't tell us anything, so
Yeah,
the Vatican doesn't tell us anything. They just only recently renamed their archives from the secret archives to the archives. But like there used to be no illusion of the fact that a lot of these organizations were very interested in keeping the knowledge they had to themselves.
totally understandable. Uh, I want to double click on a subject that seems sort of dry, but it's critically important, which is funding. These grants, who is controlling them? Who are the levers of power? Are they within the scientific community, or are they more within the government research community? And what do you think is the holdup to getting good research funding for UAP?
Sure, funding structures are very complicated. It is a whole economy unto itself, right? So there is no real single answer to who holds funding money. There are all these different organizations that get money in various ways, like the National Science Foundation. You can donate money privately to the National Science Foundation. A certain amount of tax dollars are allocated to the National Science Foundation. Uh, and they have their own little fund, not little, but they have their own fundraising organizations. And all of that money gets pooled. And then every year they have a call for grant applications. You say, I want to study this, and you have to make an argument to them that this is worth studying, that it's interesting, that you can study it, that you're the right person to study it. And you want to tell them why, like, what is the fundamental payoff for studying this stuff? And then a team of people looks at those grants and they start allocating money. You have to say how much you want for how long, and they start allocating money that way. So that's one model.
Mm-hmm.
Universities have some money. Publicly funded universities have a certain amount that they allocate, and they do basically the same thing. There are private charitable organizations like the Gates Foundation. You can apply for grants to study certain things, but they always have like a theme that they want to go for.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the Gates Foundation is like reducing world poverty,
Mm.
and you need to show that your project will like hit that mark really well.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's tons of those, but then there's also people who have money themselves. And if you're a researcher, this is much less common, but you can just go to a rich person and say, I want you to give a certain amount of money as a grant through whatever organization I work for. Let's say I work for a university, and you want to study this, and this rich person you've convinced to fund it. They then go to the university and say, I want to create a grant for this particular thing. Here's the money for it, and you can do it.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of people do that. It's such a shot in the dark,
Mm.
you know. So the levers of power are really in these organizations that have a limited amount of money they want to give, and they want to make sure they get as much payoff as they can out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes a little more sense then as to why so few people are like sending grants to the National Science Foundation to study UFOs. Because, first of all, the National Science Foundation isn't full of people who are convinced that there's something to study there. And it's not because they're like biased against it in any like deep way. It's just they don't know anything about this. And also, it's not clear how you'd make what would be the payoff. Not just like, oh, this would be good, we might get some technology out of it. Like, you have to get very specific payoffs. Like, what is the actual, benefit that you're going to be able to give in the end of 5 years, a vaccine that's going to cure some disease, or you're going to be able to like help eradicate 10% of the, dengue fever vectors in Western Africa or something. Like, that's the sort of level of specificity that a lot of these grant foundations want to see. And I don't know how you'd give them that with UAP. So I don't think that there is a good chance that those routes are going to fund UAP research. But there might be other things, like the Sci Center for in Innovative Thinking at Yale was started by the guy who created Alibaba. Was it Alibaba? But that's like the Chinese search engine, right? The Chinese Amazon or something.
Jack Ma, maybe. Does that sound right?
So the guy who created that went to Yale and gave them like $1 billion to support innovative thinking.
Wow.
So specifically to like out of the box kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there are organizations like that you might be able to appeal to, and they support Yale's Student UFO Society. That's had a few events at Yale. So there are organizations like this that are growing, but the ones that I know of that are really funding this stuff are private organizations, and they want the benefit from it. So like who's the guy I'm blanking on? Robert Bigelow. Put up a lot of money to have things like this studied, but he wants the proprietary information for himself.
Ah, interesting. Wow, that was a great roundup of the different kinds of problems. The institutions themselves being skeptical, scientists maybe being hesitant to ask for this stuff, very few to no grants that are dedicated to this subject, and then proprietary preference for keeping this information in-house. Was that a good roundup of what you just laid out?
And the lack of obvious immediate payoff to study. Like, what is the benefit?
Well,
let's get 5 years.
I'd love to pick up on that, because something that drives me a little bit batty in this area is that there do seem to be some areas of research that we have thrown literal billions of dollars at that do not have immediately obvious payoffs. Like, the Higgs boson is neat, but so far we can't make a better toaster with it. And I'm not sure anybody could write on a grant a way in which they think that could be possible. So I'm thinking about SETI, dark energy, quarks even, and bosons, gravitational waves. All this stuff comes to mind. Has it made you kind of tilt your head and wonder why all these things, superstrings are another great example, why are all these things great candidates for research money, and like a pretty reasonable theory of like extraterrestrial presence around our planet built on 8 decades of observations gets no cheese at all? Does that ruffle your feathers?
Does it ruffle my feathers? I guess it does. Now that you say it, my feathers feel ruffled. It bothers me. I do find it slightly annoying. I can give you some of the justification that maybe those people would give.
Great.
Whether I buy it or not, I'm not sure. But I mean, basic physics research seems like the sort of thing that can have enormous payoffs, even if we're not sure what they are. That's kind of the nature of the thing. We don't know what rules of physics we don't yet know, but when we figure them out, we'll probably be able to exploit them some way. We do have a track record of making some pretty valuable stuff out of basic physics research. I mean, Los Alamos Laboratory was doing some pretty high-level physics research, and they gave us the nuclear weapon, and that may have helped us win World War II. And you can make I don't think that's really what ended World War II, but I think one could make a prima facie case to legislators that we do have a record of making valuable things. There's probably all sorts of classified stuff. I mean, like when we figured out radar, that was really good, and that was closer to basic physics research. It was really acoustics and like electromagnetism research, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of what CERN is doing. But when you look at the specific research programs, if we could figure out what dark matter was, depending on what it is, we might be able to harness it for energy or something.
Mhm.
And that's all you really need to say to the legislature, because remember, there's already, like, you're not asking for them to create a new grant. You're asking for them to keep or increase the amount of funding that they gave you last year.
Mhm.
They're never going to just destroy all that funding. So once you've already built it up, it's kind of easy to be like, just give us a little more or give us the same amount and we'll do this new thing that you don't understand, but we understand, so like trust us. And that's kind of how like basic physics research keeps being pushed forward. If we had never had wars that required us to invest really heavily in things like radar and nuclear weapons, we wouldn't have anywhere near the basic physics research budget that we currently have. They probably never would have built CERN, or we wouldn't have contributed as much to it or whatever. I mean, America is not like a huge contributor to CERN, but those are the things that have historically pushed up the budget of some of these gigantic research projects, even though they're not doing empirical research. To be clear, zero empirical research is being done at CERN. CERN is, you can't see any of the stuff that they're doing. I mean, empirical research is about actual direct observation. Like the guys who were doing stuff in like the 18th century in labs in their basements were doing empirical research. They could see the things, they could touch, taste, smell, hear, document them. You could even video them if video had existed. None of that is possible at CERN. You've got a bunch of electromagnets that you're turning on and whizzing invisible theoretical particles through them, and the results are printed out onto a spreadsheet. There's no direct observation of anything. It doesn't mean it's bad science. It's not, but it's not empirical science. It's all several steps removed from any direct human observation. It's all housed within this enormous framework that's built on the very theory that it's trying to validate. And if the theory is wrong, what you're going to get is a machine that kind of continuously spits out its own data, its own version of reality, without ever making huge progress. And that may be the case with other research projects like dark matter. I mean, I would bet my money that dark matter doesn't exist, that there is no such thing that corresponds to what we're calling dark matter. There's no like weakly interacting massive particles.
Like people have been suggesting maybe we have the age of the universe estimate radically wrong, for example.
Yeah, maybe space-time itself has a kind of fissures or topological structure that causes gravitation to seemingly increase in certain areas, and that's why you get these galaxy clusters and things that don't have enough mass on their own to hold themselves together. But there are lots of other possible ways of construing physics that don't require appeal to some sort of matter that exerts gravitational force, but doesn't seem to have mass, or isn't hard or whatever, whatever empirical description you want to give to it. But those projects, I think, can at least make an interesting case on the face that if we could figure it out, maybe there's something really awesome we can do with it. Even and once you've sunk a few billion in, it's like just the sunk cost fallacy. Well, let's just do it again. I mean, otherwise we're losing all that money.
Right.
But when it comes to aliens, like, there's a bigger cost to studying ET or UFOs in the first place, and the cost isn't monetary. The cost is existential and like cognitive, of having to admit that there's even a thing there.
Yes.
And I totally understand the government and organizations' reluctance to go there, because we do not know what the consequences of having that serious public conversation are. Let me just spell out one line of consequence that I never hear anybody talk about. Everybody wonders, like, okay, if the government said, okay, we're going to study ETs, we think they're here, there's UFOs in our atmosphere, we don't know what they are, we're going to study them. If you did that, everybody worries that, like, oh, the economy would collapse because people would like quit going to work because they'd have existential crises and things. Maybe that's true. I doubt it, but people still like to go out to eat and pay their bills and stuff.
Hey, tinfoil stocks will go through the roof.
right. So just invest in the aluminum milling trade. This is what Thales did. I think it was the very first philosopher in most history of philosophy books, is he figured out how to predict like weather changes, and he knew from doing astrology then that there was going to be a drought, right? And so what he did is he leased all of the olive oil presses so that no, it wasn't a drought. It was going to be like a big heavy rain,
Okay.
right? So he leases all the olive oil presses, so that when everybody gets these big huge crops of olives, they have to come to him and pay him to crush them into olive oil, and so he becomes rich doing.
Oh
It's
my
the same
God.
thing. We
That's
we
amazing.
do this with the aluminum mills, and we'll be rich from all the tinfoil hat makers.
Pretty, yeah.
No, so I was going to say, oh, so everybody worries that like the economy is going to collapse because people are freaked out. Uh, a line of worry that I think is closer to what the governments worry about is like what happens if the U.S. says we believe these things are real, we don't know what they are, we want to study them, and then North Korea and China jointly make a statement that those things are ours. We have technology that you can't even conceive of, and the U.S. government knows it, and they just want to make you think that it's alien so that they don't make you think that we can dominate you.
Wow, I never thought about that idea. That's really fun. I mean, scary, but really fun.
It's exactly what will happen. All these other nations that are enemy nations of whichever one makes the first announcement are going to come out with whatever piece of inventive counter programming they can to just screw up things as much as they can for their enemies. And the U.S. knows this, and some number of people will believe it. And
That's
what happens
fascinating.
then?
That relates to that initial CIA response post Roswell. I think I don't have a citation for this, but there was
Sure.
an argument that the intelligence community was concerned in the 40s and 50s that Russia could use UFO propaganda to just freak out America and sort of overwhelm the system with false UFO reports. And so some
Yes.
people have alleged that the CIA partially embarked on debunking efforts in order to just cool the atmosphere to make it harder for Russia to push us around psychologically like that.
Yeah, and that's based on the actual fact that in 1952, when these two flaps happened over DC, that the emergency phone lines did get tied up, and it did cripple emergency responsibilities. So we learned from that, oh, this is a thing that could happen. But they actually, I think the U.S. government really did worry that Russia had some tech that we didn't know about, because after World War II, Russia and America and the rest of the Europeans on our side are scrambling to get every piece of German tech we can. And it's really not well understood in America that Germany was decisively the technological superpower prior to the end of World War II. I mean, America was really busy building skyscrapers and road projects and dams and things. Germany didn't have to do that because they're not enormous. They don't have like 100 million people in or whatever. So they could put their money into really good engineering and rocketry research that we couldn't. And so,
which is why we brought them all over.
Yeah. That's why we start telling them that it's okay that you were a Nazi. We'll just, give you a new identity and let you work in, NASA or wherever.
And people can look up Operation Paperclip if they want to double click on that. Well, this is so interesting. The two things came up for me in what you said about the research. One is this big question of, are we afraid to find out? And the smaller thing was, based on your interview with Kevin Knuth, it seems like you could make a case that just studying the physics of UAP might provide an avenue toward researching advanced energy. So I hope that some people like Kevin are considering writing grants for that. And I was shocked that his sticker price for a sensor array for just like one of these outposts would be like $15K. That doesn't seem so crazy, right?
Yeah.
Bigelow could fund a whole bunch of those, although I guess he'd want to keep them for himself. So we got to get the word out to some other more generous billionaires. But yeah, so this bigger question is, do you think there's a way in which science itself is hesitant to approach this topic because of some sort of subconscious and maybe at times not so subconscious concern about just discovering what's really going on?
Okay, so I'll be a nitpicky philosopher in here and say that science itself doesn't have a subconscious. Right?
Yes,
Science
anthropomorphizing, excuse me.
is a massive, inconsistent, hairy set of practices that have extended over time and culture, and it's very complicated. But the people who are doing it, and some of the organizations have the people have their own subconsciouses and their own fears and whatever. But some organizations operate with a kind of mind-like structure. Even though they're not conscious, they have a logic to them that perpetuates and that is independent of any individuals. There
Corporations
are
are
certain
people, kind of.
organizations. Oh, say it again.
Corporations are people, my friend. Kind of.
Right. I mean, they act people like, but now that they can nearly vote, that we've gone too far. But
corporations are super PACs for sure.
yes, yeah. But let's see. How do I frame this? There are certain organizations that have weird incentive structures, but at the bottom, organizations, whether they're governments or research foundations or universities or whatever, their main interest is self-perpetuation, growth, and being able to sense threats to their self-perpetuation and growth. What growth means for them can mean different things. I mean, for McDonald's to grow and for the University of California to grow are two different things, right? But they fundamentally want those things. For some organizations, the idea of a totally unexplored, really important area of science that does not comport well with the theories that they've been using for a long time, that is a threat to their self-perpetuation. I mean, think about like these sort of quasi-scientific religious organizations like the Discovery Institute that do like what do they call it? I can't believe I'm blanking on intelligent design theory.
Okay.
And like, they built like Noah's Ark theme parks and stuff. Those organizations have a pretty clear incentive to not find out that if aliens have been like visiting Earth, it just does not fit with their view of reality. They're kind of an extreme example, but you can see how other scientific organizations that are invested in a certain paradigm of research and theory might be really allergic to this just because it would screw up a lot of things for them. People wouldn't have jobs and their funding would get cut, or they would be seen as reputationally, diminished. But when you get to the actual scientists, it's much more complex. I think a lot of scientists probably are really allergic to the idea that their chosen paradigm of thought is wrong. But some aren't. And I like to divide scientists into two like fundamental types psychologically. There are scientists who are interested in taking the current scientific paradigm that they've learned and just extending it and fleshing it out and showing that it's right even more and showing what it means even more. But what they want to do is they want to apply the tools that they've been given, and they're not interested in any way in which the tools don't apply. Right? Then there's a smaller group of scientists who are really interested in figuring out the parts of reality that their paradigm doesn't work for. Like, what have we left out? The first group is focused on the paradigm itself and like making sure that it's sound and making sure that it gets extended. The other group likes the paradigm, but they want to know how it's incomplete and how it can be extended or modified. And those people tend to be more interested in stuff that doesn't fit. I think Kevin Knuth is like that. I mean, he doesn't have this sort of like Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of view that science is this perfect framework for finding out the truth, and any truth that can be known through the tools and ideas that we currently call science. I don't think it's true. I think they're wrong. I think what we currently call science is probably not this perfect way of finding truth. And so it scares me less. And I think there are other scientists in the same camp, like Kevin.
That brought us close to the famous Thomas Kuhn book, 1962's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which just comes up again and again in this subject.
Book. Yeah.
I want to ask you, as a philosopher of science, is this still kind of a controversial work within the world of science, within the world of philosophy?
In the world of science, most people don't know who Thomas Kuhn is.
Okay.
Which is crazy to me. I mean, there's so many PhD scientists who, if you ask them about the concept of a scientific paradigm or a revolution, they don't really know what you're talking about.
Wow.
And they're doing good science, but they don't know a lot about science. That's that kind of weird distinction that I brought up earlier, that scientists don't study science.
So philosophers of science are well aware of Kuhn's work.
Like old. Kuhn is like talking about Kuhn is like talking about Led Zeppelin or something. Like, yeah, it's great, but like we've gone way beyond that. There are a lot of great philosophers of science working now that have built on and modified and argued with and extended and tweaked Kuhn and other philosophers of science. But no, it's not at all a controversial book in the philosophy of science community. But it's also not just taken as like sacrosanct either. I mean, a lot of people think that Kuhn's notions of how science works are very incomplete, and I agree. Like Kuhn doesn't say anything about the concept of research programs and how those sorts of incentives, funding, for instance, affect science. It's just not on his radar. So he's not doing it all. But he did point out something really important. An interesting thing about Kuhn. Most people don't know this. I read John Mack's book Abductions recently.
Okay. Yeah, I have. Yeah.
I think I got a newer version.
Okay.
Maybe one of the last versions that got printed. And in the introduction, he talks about how when he was pursuing this research, he didn't know if he should keep doing it. And so he went over to a family friend's house who they used to have like share Christmases with, Thomas Kuhn. And
no kidding.
And asked Thomas Kuhn,
"Oh my God,
what do you think I should do with this?" And he said that Kuhn told him, "Don't even think about what the response from your colleagues is going to be. Don't even ask the question whether you're being scientific. Just listen to the people, record what they say, collect as much as you can, and then afterward reflect and think on it and do the theorizing. Don't do it in the first, but do continue doing the research." I thought that was just an amazing find.
That is stunning. I had no idea that those streams crossed, and it makes all the sense in the world. And intriguingly, it's still an area of serious challenge. I'm sure you've bumped into this. I think I've heard you talk to scientists about it, that the nuts and bolts are fine and far away is one thing. But when you start talking about people's direct experiences, even at sort of like data scale numbers of several 100,000 experiencers who've written letters, it's just really difficult to approach. And so John Mack still kind of stands like a lonely giant, even though he passed away in the early thousands, in that field. And I think history will look kindly on him for that early work. But it would be nice if there were more follow-ups. Are you aware of people doing work in and around the experiencer space right now, scientifically?
Yes, but it's different. What made John Mack's work really foundational and lasting were two things. One is that he did a really good job of documenting what experiencers reported. The second, though, was that he was the head of Harvard's School of Psychiatry in their medical school. He was a rock star already who had won a Pulitzer. There are a lot of people who are doing the first thing, who are documenting what experiencers feel, but their work won't ever become John Mack's work, because part of what made it so amazing was that this person with authority could stick this book out in front of everybody and say, "Read this, I can prove I'm not crazy. Nobody can say that I'm crazy because they've already given me a Pulitzer and made me head of their medical school's Department of Psychiatry." That's what we're missing right now. But there are other people doing really amazing work with experiencers. But like I said, it's different. It's not just different because their reputations aren't what John Mack's is. It's different because they are pursuing different angles of the experience. For instance, do you know who Andrew Gallimore is?
I don't.
Okay. He is a UFO guy, but he doesn't know that he's a UFO guy.
Okay.
He and I'll tell you what I mean by that, right? I don't think that if you asked him if he studied UFOs, he would say that he does. He doesn't. What he does study is he's developed this medical protocol where he can take people and he can give them a slow drip of DMT. So that the DMT, if you've ever done DMT, DMT is like the 12 craziest minutes of your life.
Right. And okay, is this the person who found a way to expand that to 45 minutes?
Yeah, they can do it for hours now. Yeah.
Oh.
He's developed this protocol and has gotten IRB approval. They're doing these things where you can lie down and take a DMT trip that lasts pretty much as long as you want it. And the good thing about DMT they found is that you don't build up a tolerance for it for some reason. The effects don't diminish over time. And the reason I say that he's doing something like John Mack's work is that one thing that's really, really consistently reported with DMT breakthrough experiences is that you meet beings that talk to you and communicate with you and that have a certain physical form that you describe, and people across experiences describe them similarly. People who've never heard any of this mythology, they experience the same things. And so,
Entity encounters that match up experience
yeah,
to experience, person to person.
very much like when Whitley Strieber published Communion with that painting of the gray alien on the front, and everybody freaked out and was like, I've seen that. Nobody had seen that image portrayed before.
Mm.
But, you know, Whitley Strieber, I think he said that he and his wife quit counting the letters they had gotten when it got to the 500,000th one.
Oh my God. I just opened the communion letters book the other day, and she starts with saying it's several hundred thousand,
Yeah.
but I hadn't heard that it was 500,000.
That's when they stopped. They were like, there's no point anymore. But you go down
Wow.
to Rice University now and you can read all of them at the Archives of the Impossible. Do you know Jeff Kreikel?
He's on my list of.
If you get him on here, he's a beautiful human being.
Cool. Is he an SCU person?
He's not. No, he's a philosopher of religion he wrote a book with Whitley, and he oversees the Archives of the Impossible at Rice University, but he's much more into the esoteric religious aspects of these things. He's also a character in American Cosmic, but pseudonymously.
Okay.
So anyway, so Andrew Gallimore has this protocol now, and what he's studying is what conversations people have with these entities. He sends them into these long DMT trips with lists of questions to ask them. And some of the questions are like questions that might be able to evidence whether there's really a being on the other side. So for instance, we know that the human brain has only so much computational power, right? Like if we just look at a neuron as a certain as a node, like a transistor or something.
And we don't know exactly how much, but maybe like 10 to the 17 flops a second or something.
Sure, yeah, it's something large. And we can put an upper limit on it. And so he can send them in. I don't know if he's done this yet or if his reports are going to include this yet, but he could in principle go in and do something like ask the beings, what are the prime divisors of this, 55-digit number or something.
That is a great idea. Something that would require basically more operations per second than you had seconds in which to execute it.
So that you could tell conclusively either this person has some access to information beyond what their brain could possibly do, or not, if they get it wrong. I mean, I guess they could say, we're not going to tell you, but if you could get one, that would be pretty interesting. So I think Andrew Gallimore is doing something akin to what John Mack was doing, but it's not with UFO. I mean, John Mack wasn't really doing the UFOs, abductions. A lot of those people don't even report being in a UFO. So there's some overlap there. There are other people who are doing it from more of a mythological standpoint. People who've had strange encounters with dreams. Yeah, so there's some work. It's just not as easy to find because it's not a rock star who's doing it. John Mack was really a kind of savant of compassion, I think.
That's interesting. You can see that in the video of him speaking with the kids at the aerial school, for example. He's extremely present for them, and they
he really is.
What this brought me to was just this feeling of sort of low-key overwhelm that goes along with this. I think maybe a lot of our sci-fi tends to imagine that we're encountering beings who are basically like us, but they have warp drives, and then some more ambitious sci-fi, like kind of Arrival, tinkers with the idea that like maybe they understand time on a different level than we do, or like other parts of reality. But as we approach this subject and think about it, like genuinely being true that we might be engaging with civilizations that are thousands or millions of years ahead of us, it stands to reason that might involve being ahead of us in all kinds of ways that aren't just how to fly around. And it's overwhelming to think about all the psychic information and the physics, not just 1 or 2 notches ahead of us, but 1,000 notches ahead. It's difficult to process. And I wonder if you think that might have something to do with why people who do have more information about this, if they do, might be a little hesitant to explain. Sometimes I think that in addition to national security concerns, just this brute confusion might account for some of the hesitancy to disclose a little more of this information.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that so 2 important things come to mind. One is that whatever the truth is about such beings, there's a good probabilistic argument to be made that their nature, the facts of the situation, can't be accurately conveyed or described to us using the concepts that we have.
Mm-hmm.
Right? All the concepts and senses and ways of thinking that human beings have access to were evolved for survival abilities, and then were later developed out of the particular context of history and technology and stuff that we have made.
Mm-hmm.
A race of beings that have developed entirely independently of us for an unknown amount of time with totally different biologies. Understanding them would require a whole conceptual framework that just does not match ours.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there may not be any words to it. I imagine that if you could sit down with whatever is behind some of these UAP objects, and if it's an intelligence, and if you could talk to it, you would ask it, like, are you an alien? And the best answer would be something like, kind of an alien. We're also kind of like a ghost, or maybe a witch, or like a god or something. Well, you really don't have a word that makes sense of what we are. That's probably the best that we could get on all the questions. And if we're asking how their technology works, I mean, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If you don't know it doesn't matter that Leonardo da Vinci was miraculously smart. You cannot really explain to him how an iPhone works without being like, okay, well, first I need to tell you what we think an electron is. And then we tell you, okay, there's this stuff silicon, and you can etch funny little patterns into it, and it can.
You've got to walk through like 5 different scientific revolutions before you get to that piece of tech.
Yes, I think that would be what the conversation would have to be like if we wanted to understand a really radically advanced piece of alien technology. Is they'd have to sit us down and be like, okay, well, 5 billion years ago, our planet was in the cooling phase, and then some proteins got together and they made something that was very different from your stuff, and then on and on and on. It just may take forever to get us there. We may need different senses to understand it.
Right. Yeah.
If they have like electroception, like an eel, and they have all the same, imagine they have all the same senses that we do, plus they have electroception, their science might be cashed out in terms of senses that we can't comprehend. Right.
Right. Yeah.
Science is not a universal language.
If the astral world is real, they might have evolved to perceive it in ways that we don't. So they might be operating on planes that we currently can't access.
If they can see electromagnetic, fields the way we think owls might be able to, that might be a big part of their scientific language, and there might be zero way of translating that. So we would need a language of science that would work across these things. And how would you build such a language? It's very hard to see. You would need to build I have this test in my mind. And I used to think another philosopher of science created this, but I've looked for like 2 years and asked lots of other philosophers of science where this came from, and nobody has ever heard it except me. So I'm taking credit for it at this point.
Yeah, maybe it was a download.
So here's my test for whether a language might possibly be good enough to communicate between really alien beings. Okay, you and I are going to have a conversation about science. I'm going to explain how something works to you.
Okay.
But first, we're going to surgically take all of the nerves from your eyeballs and reroute them to the auditory parts of your brain. And we're going to take all the nerve endings from your ears and reroute them to the visual processing part of your brain so that you hear colors and you see sounds. And then, if I can explain to you how this piece of technology works in some language that transmits just fine, we're getting sort of close to a language that we could use with aliens. That's something like the challenge of speaking to aliens.
That's a fascinating Cronenbergian thought experiment. It's terrifying. Small thought.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I said there were 2 things
that
came to mind, and I can't remember what the second is.
Okay, I'll just interject this
please.
Very insignificant metaphor that comes to mind. It's just idiomatic speech. Like you can translate the literal words between Russian and American, or like German and American. I've heard there's a German one that's like happy as a pig in lard, or happy as a maggot in bacon, I think is a classic German or Nordic phrase or something. And so
German.
there might be all these ways in which like we could literally translate, but we wouldn't understand kind of like the fundamental gist of what they're attempting
it just
to
sounds like nothing. When this happens in Arrival at the end, that end scene when they finally translate the message from the aliens, and it's not to ruin it for anybody, it's a offer weapon. And then you're like, what does that mean? offer like, are you trying to get us to offer something to you? Or are you offering something to us? What is weapon? Is weapon really what we think it means? It just becomes nearly impossible. Oh, the second thing I was going to say. So you were saying maybe there's reluctance on the part of people who do know more to say to us. And my first point was that maybe they don't really know more, because maybe the problem of communication is just so gnarly that knowing anything is like going to take lifetimes, or it might require us to like modify our bodies in ways that we can have the senses that are required to have the language that they have or something. Another thought experiment that I've wondered a lot about is, imagine that those first problems are solved somehow, and there really is communication possible, and that somebody in the government has sat down with the leaders of the ETs or whatever and gotten the message from them. Can I imagine a truth that is so intense that anybody who heard it would keep it as a secret for the rest of their life? Can I imagine something that I guarantee if you could show the person the truth, nobody would ever tell anybody? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I think you can. I think that it's at least plausible. I don't think there's necessary reason to think that this is what's going on, but you can imagine like the boundaries of such an answer. And I'll give the one example that I've come up with that I think kind of works is, imagine that somebody has sat down with the ETs or whatever, and they say, look, we're here, the ETs, because before any of us came to this physical realm, we all existed in some previous state, and we chose to be born into this realm for some great purpose that has not yet been fulfilled. And one of the preconditions was that we had to forget what that great purpose was, because then we wouldn't be able to do it. And the other, most of the ETs, most of the UAPs that you see are actually a rogue group who are trying to screw up the great purpose. And if we tell you what they're about, it will involve telling you what the great purpose is, and it'll just destroy everything that we've come here for. If you believe something like that were true, I can imagine that anybody who heard it and was convinced really would keep it a secret, right? So I don't know if that gives us a good boundary or a good sort of sandbox to play in to think about what sorts of things would and wouldn't be kept secret. But I think that if there is somebody who really knows what the hell is going on here, whatever they know must be so strange and interesting and significant that they haven't leaked it very well. And a lot of people say, well, if it hasn't leaked, it must just not be true. But I think that there's at least this other option, however remote it may be, that the truth could be knowable, but it could be so terrible or so significant that you would never, ever communicate it.
It is fascinating. It made me think of that story reported by Richard Dolan, that somebody who watched Jimmy Carter get briefed about this, then witnessed the president
cried in his office.
Yeah, holding his head in his hands. And something I think about sometimes is the thought experiment of talking to like an uncontacted people's and the like a leader of an uncontacted people, like maybe the type of group that might become a cargo cult, but say they're not a cargo cult yet, and they haven't talked to anybody. And if you just rolled in with your iPhone and your Tesla and you said like, this is all real and it's super powerful and it's all around you, you can tell your people or not. Like if you were that person and you went home that night, you can sort of intuit emotionally the challenge of saying to everybody else, well, we live in a very small part of this big, busy world, and we don't have much control over it. And that's scary. Like I could sympathize with a leader choosing not to share that information.
Sure. And I think it's easier to sympathize with them if you also remember that they're not thinking in the same Western sort of naturalist scientific mindset as you. Those people live in a magical worldview where there's spirit beings already. And if you show up with an iPhone, you're just another weird spirit that we don't know what you're up to, but like we've been doing our life here for as long as history has been going in our view. And we're not particularly worried about what kind of magic you have, because we know that magic is real. I think that's really kind of the way that a lot of indigenous cultures work, and it might be because they're right. It might be
Yeah.
because they really do encounter weird things that aren't just UFOs, and they're not really all that concerned with it. That's, I think, why we don't see as many UFO reports out of places like Africa and Central Australia, because they don't interpret them as technology. They're like, oh, it's spirit beings. We see that. They come to us in our dreams and stuff.
Shout out to our pal who we were discussing off air, Stephen Brown, for talking about this. He's got some really good riffs about how embarrassing and unfortunate it is that that we haven't taken indigenous lore seriously about people from the stars. And there are many active cultures who would tell you this stuff's not strange to them, and Western science might be just catching up to it. But it's been common knowledge within some of these intellectual traditions for time immemorial.
Well, you know, it's hard to pay attention to them after you nearly exterminate all of them. So, like, I think that's kind of one of the problems that we've cornered ourselves with. Is, you know, there were like, you know, however many nations of people who are already here in North America who are like, yeah, star beings came and they gave us stuff. They gave us the buffalo and stuff, and then they took all those buffalo and slaughtered them and made belts for our factories out of them. It's just, yeah, so it's a weird history. I mean, that might really feed into the history of the UAP subject once we all flesh it out, but we don't know.
It's fascinating that some of these older UAP reports seem to meld in with culture in a way that they don't currently. Like, I was talking with Stephen Bassett a little bit about why it seemed okay for beings to visit more primitive versions of our civilizations, but they don't seem to do it now. Like there's no contemporary White House lawn moment where they try to establish public contact. It's sort of intuitive that maybe at a smaller, less complex scale, they feel a little more comfortable interacting with civilizations, and then as they get more technologically advanced, they tend to hold back. But as we get more advanced, they hold back. I don't know. Do you have any?
It would make sense. The stakes go up, right? You could, if you land in a small tribe, you might piss them off, but you're just pissing them off. Like if you land on the White House lawn and piss us off, it's like things have gotten so complex, you might not even be able to predict what's going to happen. It might be a nuclear war or something. Right. And like, what are the advantages? It's unclear what the advantages or incentives for them might be. If you're super technologically advanced, what is there about mingling with us in that sort of, you know, public TV news way that presents any opportunity for you?
Yeah, their incentives. I actually would like to put a pin in their incentives and maybe loop back to it at the end. But while we're nearby to some of the secret keeping, having given them the benefit of the doubt and empathized with the challenges that leaders may have faced, you know, if Grush is right and there are 5,000 people in the establishment who know some part of this, I want to ask you, as a scientist, as a philosopher of science, does it bother you on some fundamental level that there's a disconnect between the understanding of the nature of reality, between like the public who's doing earnest science and the private organizations that may know more? If that's true, does it or would it bother you?
Would it bother me?
Like, I used to think that we lived in a world where the most complicated science was accessible to everybody, and you might not understand
No, that's not true.
But somebody could theoretically explain it as well as possible, right? And that we all had kind of access to the frontier together. And one of the things that I have found emotionally upsetting about the potential of UAP being real is this idea that we might not have public access to the sort of cutting edge understandings of the nature of reality. And, you know, for a few years, that's one thing. For 80 to 100 years, it starts to get more frustrating, I think. So I guess I'm wondering if you're harboring any disgruntlement about that. I don't want to trigger you, but I'm curious about your emotional feelings about that. Your condition, your anger. Do you have any anger about this subject?
Do I have any anger? I'm not an angry person by nature.
That's great.
I do feel some sadness when I think about this subject, but I don't feel the anger that maybe others feel at the idea that truth is being withheld from us in that way. My co-host on the UAP Studies podcast, Jason Guillemette, is furious about this. I mean, you can't bring it up without him being mad as hell that somebody like knows things about reality that we don't.
I tend in that direction.
I'll give you some reasons maybe to soften it. The first is that you couldn't understand cutting edge science anyway. And it's not because you're not smart enough. It's because it's all written in a language of mathematics that takes decades to gain facility with. So somebody could write down all the truths of the universe, but you wouldn't be able to make any sense of it. They could give it to you, but it wouldn't be comprehensible.
That's a good point.
There's Wittgenstein has this beautiful line where he says, if a lion could speak, we couldn't understand him. And I think the universe, the deep truths of the universe, some of them are like that. The ones that we call scientific truths are sort of like that. It takes a long, long time to know what the hell any of it means. I mean, you have to understand what a Hilbert space is. And to understand what a Hilbert space is, you need to understand like 15 other extremely complex concepts, and then others and others and others. It just takes years. So that might be one thing, but I think most people probably aren't worried about that kind of knowledge. They don't like just the facts of like there's aliens doing X, right? The reason I'm very curious, but the reason that it doesn't eat me up inside is that the questions that really do eat me up inside are like deep existential spiritual questions that I'm not sure would be answered or really addressed if I knew that there were aliens doing anything here or not. It's like I used to be worried about morality was the central concern of my life. And for the longest time, I felt that I needed to find out if there was a God. Because clearly, God would have the answers or whatever. But at some point, I came to this realization that even if I met God, what if God told me that, like, yeah, beating the hell out of homeless people is good. That's what I want you to do. Look, no, you're just wrong. You're wrong. I mean, why? So the question is like, why should I trust God or just believe whatever God says about morality? Is it just because he can hurt me if I don't do what he says? That's not a very good reason to do what a person says, at least in a moral sense. So at that point, the question of God became much less important to me because he couldn't answer it for me anyway. I still want to know if there's a God. I think there probably is a God. But it doesn't have that significance to me. And aliens are kind of the same way. Like maybe they're here or not, but I think that most of the really deep questions that pain people at their hearts, even if they knew for certain whether there were aliens here or doing whatever, it really would not answer those questions for them. They would still have this gnawing uncertainty inside them. And that's what I think people feel angry about, is they think that somebody has the answer that can heal that gnawing uncertainty. And I don't think the government does. I mean, I don't think the answers are written in a language the government knows how to read, or it's not written in the language of mathematics either. I think that these subjects like UAP, actually, if you follow them far enough, go into those areas of the esoteric and the spiritual and the religious, and those are places where maybe real answers do lie, but it doesn't just stop with what the government may or may not know.
You're right. That's extremely calming. Thank you. Is it your prior expectation that humans will be largely fine in a post-disclosure world, that we'll maybe go through some kind of tumultuous adaptation, but then we'll still pay our taxes and go to work and watch basketball?
No, it's not. And it's probably because I don't think humanity's fine for the next 100 years. I think that we're on the cusp of technological changes that are so gnarly and unforeseeable that it's not really even possible to say what humanity will be 100 or 500 years from now. I mean, it's easy for me to imagine that in 100 years, humans won't even have physical bodies like we do.
Yeah.
We'll be able to do all sorts of crazy technological things, whether we should be doing them or whether it's good for us or not.
Yeah, I have a similar intuition, just hopping in, that 100 years from now, just playing out the thought of experiments of the futurism that I've explored, it's reasonable to guess that there might be far more non-physical bodies, or bodies on digital substrates, than there will be physical human bodies in the world. And maybe those minds will have all sorts of concatenation formats where there are bigger swarms and smaller individuals. But I think it's reasonable to guess that there might be many more such minds than classic edition human bodies, even a brief 100 years, which seems pretty short.
I agree. And that doesn't even necessarily include just simulated minds. I mean, we might live in a world that just has trillions and trillions of simulated minds. So I think we're in for a hell of a ride already. Whether disclosure happens or not, I don't think disclosure is one thing. I think that disclosure is the wrong framing, actually.
Okay.
Because if people just want enough evidence to decide whether they think that there's some non-human intelligence doing something around here, there's plenty of it. You don't have to wait for the United States government to come out and say something. And secondly, I don't think there's a disclosure scenario I can imagine that does the thing people who want disclosure imagine. I can't imagine a scenario where somebody comes out and says something and then everybody believes it, and now we're in a new world where we all know, right?
Yeah.
There's going to be so much disinformation. I mean, the United States is currently divided over whether people in Springfield are eating dogs. Like, you can fucking go to Springfield and just watch people and answer the questions for yourself if you were really, really interested in that. And that's an empirically decidable question. And it's still dividing us. The idea that one or some group of government officials could come out and make a pronouncement is as singularly important as answering the question of whether there are non-human intelligences here, and that America would just like all get on the same page, is a fantasy. So disclosure is a fantasy. What we really need is buy-in. What we need is individuals to decide and then push for what they think is a reasonable research agenda, a reasonable way of doing society. But your question was like, do I have a generally positive view or not? And I don't want to sound like I'm saying we're all screwed. But humanity is going to be transformed in the next 100 years. And some of the things we find out are going to be really surprising, whether it has to do with aliens or not. Like, we start digitizing our minds or sort of integrating with sort of neurological technologies will probably wake us up to certain features about the nature of our being that we hadn't noticed before. And that might be more significant than just finding out there are other beings with bodies flying around spacecraft.
I really agree. I want to pick up on your point about buy-in and your point about evidence. I was stunned walking into this subject that it's not difficult to find the evidence. And I started thinking, what's difficult is to think about it. Like, I, for some reason, thought about this early on as like an octopus off a windshield, like an extremely strange thing that's very close to you that just keeps sliding off of your brain's focus area.
It's a great metaphor.
Thank you. It's vivid. And there are a couple friends I've tried to onboard who have just sort of said, no, I'm not willing to engage with this, no matter how much information you give me. In fact, to some extent, the more information you give me, the more annoyed I'm going to get with you, and the deeper I'm going to dig in. And I wonder what you think, as somebody close to the scientific community, about the tendency that I've heard about, you probably have heard a lot about too, of some scientists to be very interested, but still pretty private about this stuff. The Jacques Vallée's phrase "invisible college" is unfortunately still alive and well, despite our friend Stephen Brown's move toward a visible college, which is great. It's much needed, obviously. But I wonder, here I am trying to tease you into anger again. Are you angry at any of these scientists? Do you think that some of these people who are being a little more private need to, or could benefit the discourse by stepping a little more openly into public discourse?
So I have a list in my head I'm going through of the scientists, the really good scientists I know who are fairly private about this and what they're private about. Let's distinguish some kinds. There are scientists who have knowledge in their area of expertise that applies to this. And they understand something about this that the rest of us don't. And they're being quiet. I don't know any. or I don't know that I know any such
Okay.
scientists. They're apparently very quiet. The scientists who are using their area of expertise directly on this subject are generally pretty vocal. I mean, that's what they're studying. They're fine talking about it.
Cool.
That would bother me if there were a ton who, I mean, and maybe that's the public perception that there's like a ton of physicists who really basically know what's going on and they're just not talking about it.
Hmm.
That is not the case.
Cool.
And I mean, it's not just that I don't know any such people, so I'm assuming it's not the case. Just the way physics research works, everybody's knowledge is so specialized that, like, just because you have a PhD in physics doesn't mean that you know a whole lot outside of your own very narrow area of physics that you study, right?
Mhm.
So, like Kevin Knuth, you mentioned trying to get him on to talk about, or trying to get him to talk about like alternative energy methods. I bet he would say, I don't know anything about that. Like my area of expertise just does not deal with that. My area deals with like detection of neutrinos and stuff like that. But it's amazing from the outside how a person can have a doctorate in something and not have a huge general knowledge of it. But it's kind of like me as a philosopher. Somebody who's like, "Oh, tell me about Schopenhauer's philosophy." I'd be like, "Dude, I've read like an article about Schopenhauer in the Wikipedia page, but..." And they're like, "You're a philosopher. He's a famous philosopher." I'm like, "Yeah, but there's a lot to know and
Yeah.
not much time."
Okay. That's a
So
good point.
I don't think that's the kind of the scientists that we should be mad about. That's the kind. No, that's the kind that if they exist, we should be mad about. But I don't really think there's many of them. The ones that do exist are being quiet because they have NDAs because they work for like Northrop Grumman and they've analyzed some material. But even then, compartmentalization often keeps those people from knowing anything about what they're analyzing. They'll be brought a piece of material and they know the deal is you just analyze this and you don't ask anything about it. Because if it was from North Korea, we wouldn't tell you. We wouldn't risk, breaching national security just for your curiosity. So that's not really how it works. The other scientists, though, that I do know that have much more intimate knowledge or experience with this subject who aren't public about that, I understand exactly why they're not public because it's their personal life. It's no longer really professional knowledge. Like I know very well-known scientists who've had beings like physical beings come
Whoa.
into their life and
Wow.
do things to them. And I don't know if I'd tell anybody that if I cared about what people thought about me. Like, just it would have no professional value. It doesn't have anything to do with what you study. It doesn't. Your PhD doesn't make that really more credible if you really think about it. What? So somebody knows some physics. So like now I'm supposed to believe them that like spirit beings have come to them and but that's real. I know quite a few people who are in that sort of position. They're
Wow.
well respected in their area, and when they've had their own personal encounters. But I don't see why they would talk about it other than to friends or people who they trust not to tell anything. And so I can't be
Yeah.
mad about that. I mean, but on the other hand, I do wish they all would at once come forward because that would be really good for the other people who've had
Yeah.
experiences.
Yeah. And their personal experiences are a pressing human reason to open the discourse about this, to examine some of these hundreds of thousands of cases so that people feel more comfortable talking about it and we can support them psychologically, if nothing else.
Yeah.
I'm going to try one more time to get you angry.
Do it.
Okay. The NASA report. I've heard you mention a couple times that you really don't like this phrase that we have no evidence that these things are extraterrestrial. So I want to tease that out a little bit and see if I can get you to blow your stack.
I dislike it deeply. Yeah. So to set up why it does annoy me, uh, these NASA reports by NASA and Aero and a few other organizations have come out, and in their conclusion sections of reports that they were required to write per their own the mandate that established them, they will say in their conclusion section, "There's no evidence we've found that any of these things are extraterrestrial." And that annoys the hell out of me because it's and I know how scientists work. I know how career science is done. In order to say we do or don't have evidence of blank. You have to define what counts as evidence of blank very clearly. And I know for a fact that there is no shared definition of evidence of extraterrestrials. I don't even know if somebody asked me as a philosopher of science how I would come up with a shared definition that everybody could get on board with. I don't know what I would do. What counts? Like, I mean, if I could watch a being be born on Jupiter and come here, see it all, that would be pretty good evidence.
Mm-hmm.
But just finding a craft or something, how do you tell that it wasn't made here? That origin? What does it even mean to originate on a different planet? Like, oh, it's very complicated. So I know that when those reports come out and they say things like that, that not only is it pretty much meaningless because there's no shared conception of what would count as evidence of extraterrestrial. I know the people who wrote them also know that just as well as I do. And that does really bother me because it's disingenuous and it's really misleading to the public. It's also never the question that was asked. I don't know of any mandate that has said we're establishing this office in the end of so many years. You have to tell us whether you have found evidence of extraterrestrials. I don't think that has ever happened.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
they're answering the question.
Mandate. It wasn't the NASA study panel mandate.
So they're answering a question that was never asked to them, which is weird, and it's not something that normally gets done in context like this. They're answering a question that can't actually be answered because the terms of the question and the answer are poorly defined and contentious.
Mm-hmm.
And it gives people a false sense of the work that's actually been done. And what annoys me the most is I'm not sure who influences the reports to write those things. What is the incentive? The scientists on the panel generally would not want to do this. It's not their job. They don't even want to touch the concept unless they've been made to.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that does bother me. Maybe you have succeeded in rousing my annoyance a little bit.
You got angry very calmly, so bravo for that.
I'm screaming on the inside constantly. That's how
It has really bothered me too. In fact, the only email I've ever sent to NASA is, "What is your standard of evidence?" I was just trying
to
to
not have one.
No, they don't. And I will say in their defense, I went back and looked at the report today because I wanted to bring this up, and they say conclusive evidence, and then they say at the end, no reason to conclude, which at least gives them a little breathing room. I didn't go look this up, but I remember Arrow using language that was that careful. I think Arrow just went for no evidence. And I want to suggest that I think there's like a slight sleight of hand here going on, where they substitute the idea of evidence for the concept of proof. And that feels tricky to me. Conclusive evidence is basically a synonym for proof, but evidence is not a synonym for proof. And go ahead.
Okay. Well, I was going to say that all those are just terms that need to be defined in a normal science paper. If they concluded something, they would tell you somewhere in the methods of the introduction section, here's what we mean by this. Here's what we think would count as conclusive evidence or proof or evidence or reason to believe something. And that's never defined.
To defend again the NASA panel, I think they do a pretty good job of at least saying, when I was just like searching the report for the word evidence, I noticed that they call for better standards of evidence. And then I noticed they also say, really good sensor data demonstrating some of these claimed accelerations would count as evidence. And they don't have access to that data because they didn't crunch in like the USS Princeton or Nimitz recording information. But that is what I was thinking about when people say, like when Arrow says there's no evidence that they're extraterrestrial. I ask, where that takes my brain is, what do you think something coming down from 80,000 to 20,000 feet in 2 seconds suggests? If that's not evidence of some kind of like advanced propulsion technology, then nothing.
Yeah, but it could have been built here, right?
Could be.
It doesn't have to have been extraterrestrial. Like the extraterrestrial thing to me is I don't know what the evidence for that. The evidence that it's not made by any human. They could have just easily concluded there's evidence that we have something that's not made by any method of manufacture or according to any principles of physics that we understand.
Right.
That's a conclusion they really could draw from that.
Yeah.
But the origins question to me is very different. It could have originated on. It could be I heard Hal Puthoff say it could have been a medieval society medieval secret society that figured out how to levitate, and they're just enclosing themselves in like a metal room and levitating really quick. Like They could be from
Sure.
here.
Right. Well, that's interesting. I guess I just want to circle around this one more time, and try to weave in this idea that there's a reasonable theory out there, like the extraterrestrial theory is a one reasonable potential explanation for all these sightings and all this data. And like the Big Bang or dark matter, we don't know if it's true, but it might be worth investigating. And to me, it seems reasonable to make a claim like an object descending from borderline the edge of space, question mark, to 20,000 feet quickly is evidence that could support a theory of extraterrestrial origin. Is it proof of extraterrestrial origin? No, it's not. But would you say it's reasonable to put it in the category of supporting evidence for that theory?
Yeah, I mean, thinking as trying to be a precise, rigorous philosophical thinker, I think the way it would support an extraterrestrial hypothesis is by the fact that it would first support manufacture according to some principles that we don't think any terrestrial group possesses.
Mm-hmm.
And that sort of only leaves one other option, right? Some non-terrestrial or some terrestrial group that we don't know anything about.
Mm-hmm.
I think I would support that conclusion. It's either there's some terrestrial group that's got something really special and hasn't used it in ways that we would expect them to, like by dominating the earth. And maybe it's because it's an independent group of people who really has no interest in economically dominating the world. That seems possible to me.
And do you think it makes sense to use the word evidence in that context? Like this is evidence that would support the theory that some advanced species, whether they're local or from far away, is operating?
Yeah, sure. I mean, defining evidence in a philosophically rigorous way is way harder than it seems like it should be.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I would generally think that it does seem to increase the probability of one of those two, like basic explanatory hypotheses. Yeah.
So pivoting away from anger, since we had our fill of that, are you excited about this moment? Do you feel like the sparkle of promise that we might be entering a new world, threshold of new information, deeper understanding?
I don't. As much as I have to temper my anger, I think I temper it both ways because I don't know what would be so great about it. Like I'm gonna deflate. I'm a boring person to listen to on this point, but I don't know what the promise is that's so sparkly. Like it would be neat to find out that there were aliens doing stuff around here. But it'd be like getting a Ferrari. Like it's fun for a week, and then you're like, God, this gotta drive a Ferrari now. And that's a whole new thing. I haven't even thought about what that means. There'd be a lot of change and unanticipated consequences of any new knowledge or any new change. I would much prefer a world where I found out that everybody was going to be able to pay their bills and afford food and medicine tomorrow, and we could like get on with doing our lives, because I don't think that what we need is like to find out how anti-gravity propulsion works. I don't think it really solves any like deep human existential needs. I mean, like maybe existential needs for the race, like for power, clean energy or something. It would do that. That would be exciting to me.
Mm-hmm.
Finding out that they're aliens, I would have questions, but I also have gotten to a point in my thinking where I've had to reckon with the fact that I would not totally believe everything they said either way. If the aliens showed up and were like, yeah, there's like 5 gods, and we talk to them, I'd be like, I don't know if you know what you're talking about. Like, if they feel like they have answers to all the existential questions that plague me, I'm going to know, how'd you figure that out and why? And that's what would really excite me. The sparkle of hope that I do have is that we'll get deeper into this and we'll realize that UFOs are not the central thing, that there are way, way deeper and more interesting forces and ideas and phenomena in our universe than our current worldview admits. And I think that's true. And that does give me hope. I enjoy that every day, because I've increasingly come to live in a world where I think I am interacting with those realities. Wow. And that's all I'll say.
Okay. All right. Maybe I'll save dialing in on that for a future episode. But I did just want to ask about the Yale teaching because I remembered it was called More Things in Heaven and Earth. And I'm a big Hamlet fan and I love that inspiration. So I just wondered how it went. Did you guys have fun? Did you enjoy speaking about UAP at Yale?
It was great. It was actually, this is the second time I've gotten to go speak at Yale, which is surreal.
Yeah, that's great. Congratulations.
Thank you. I'll tell you the downsides first. The two downsides are that Yale's cafeteria food is exactly the same cafeteria food that every other university has, which is very disappointing to me.
Oh, no, it's all Aramark?
Yeah, probably like Cisco or something, right? It's just the same crap. And the second disappointing thing, which I feel compelled to point out every time I talk about Yale, is the fact that their campus is worth billions of dollars and it's a beautiful wonderland of like architecture and intellectual history. And you go one block off the campus and everybody is poor. And that school has succeeded in keeping every penny it generates for itself. And I think it's immoral and shameful. And it makes me feel bad for having anything to do with it as prestigious as the school is and as lovely as some of the individual people involved, where it's hard not to feel that moral pain when you're walking around there.
I'm sure many of those individuals feel a similar concern.
They do. I know they do. I know students and faculty who do. So it's, but the event itself was beautiful. It was great. Danny Sheehan was there. I had not met him before. Got to have dinner with him and Stephen Brown and Kevin Knuth and myself.
Wow.
And Jim Garrison. Those were the 5 people. And I gave the closing talk, which is normally kind of an honor, but it's also 7 o'clock at night after dinner. So it's kind of sleepy in there. And I felt a little sleepy, but the talk that I gave was arguing that I think the UFO UAP community is about to make a serious mistake of framing. It's going to create a new discipline. It's going to try at least of UAP studies or something. But it's going to make the mistake of framing UAPs in terms of extraterrestrial craft. And that's a mistake because that whole framework was largely invented in the late 1940s as a way of covering up some anomalous phenomena, right? We said, oh, they're not extraterrestrial craft. They're just technology that we haven't told you about, right? It's a Project Mogul balloon or something. But that extraterrestrial technology framework was adopted as a thing to dismiss, right? It was kind of a straw man because there are a lot other strange phenomena that, oh, my phone was being weird. There are a lot of other strange phenomena that don't fit that are just equally as well evidenced. And I think the mistake we're going to make is by developing a new discipline that is framed around too narrow of a conception of the anomalous. And we're going to exclude lots of well-evidenced anomalies and strange things that are just as worth studying and might have something fundamental to do with the part that we are recognizing, the UAP part. And that, I think, was a well-received argument, even though it's a little dour. But I got to say it in a really nice room that had stained glass in it, so that's a win.
Nice, man. Thank you for reconstituting that argument for us. That's a good insight and challenging. Well, on the way out, I'd love to kind of lightning round you. Do you have time for like 3 more questions?
Yeah, bring it.
Okay. Heard you do that in interviews, so I'd throw it back at you. And actually, the first 2, I'd love to hear you answer questions that you routinely ask people.
Oh, please, yeah.
Great. One is, if you could wave a magic wand and throw infinite money at this subject, how would you like to see it researched? And another is, what books do you recommend that people read? And then the third is mine, so I'll loop back around to it.
Okay, so if I could study this with infinite money, I would have I would buy a bunch of Kevin Knuth's observation platforms. I would hire a bunch of people who have unusual cognitive abilities, and I would find them using an app on the Apple App Store and on the Google Play Store, and I would make it look like it's an app to test your ESP abilities, and the top very high scoring percentage of the people who played that app, I would contact them privately and hire them to do remote viewing.
That is such a great idea. I've never heard anybody say that. Good
Yeah.
concept.
Might search the App Store if you're interested. I would
Really?
hire those people, and then I would hire Andrew Gallimore and his team. And the fourth group I would hire is a red team of people who are open-minded scientists, but whose job it is to shoot down all of our arguments coming from the other combined team. I would get that first combined team together, and I would make them work interdisciplinarily to find ways of theorizing the conclusions that they all draw together into some larger theory. And then I would have the red team debate them by writing counter papers, counter arguments. And I would give them about 10 years to do that. And I would gamify their bonuses so that I could ensure that they kept doing it and having fun with it. That's how I'd want to study this.
That's amazing, man. I'm so glad you had such a deep, awesome answer to that, because I've heard you ask other people and nobody was as good as yours. So good job.
Thanks. I don't have a specific book, but I would tell somebody to pick up a history of magic and religion, or magic and science, like a history of alchemy. And because I think the value of reading about these other worldviews and seeing that they're not stupid in the way that we thought they were, is that they introduce frameworks that I think are probably a lot more useful for understanding reality now. And I think most of those sort of religious or magical kind of ways of thinking got shot down, not because they failed in any empirical way, but because they were socially unacceptable or persecuted in other ways or something. For instance, if you think alchemy is stupid, I wish I could resurrect Isaac Newton and have him tell you differently, because he was not, like, Isaac Newton wasn't a genius. He was like a miracle, and he was a practicing alchemist his entire life. That's most of what he did.
Really?
So yeah, this is, I mean, undoubtedly, it was astrology and spirits and alchemical mystical knowledge, and he was maybe the smartest human who's ever lived that we know of.
Is there evidence that he pulled off some genuine transmutations?
Yeah, we just call them chemistry now. Right, everything the alchemists did that we know worked and can reproduce in laboratory situations, we just call chemistry. They were the first chemists.
Looping back to that idea about bringing magic into the light, and then it's science.
Yeah, but they would argue that there's certain sorts of transformations that are possible but can only be achieved by people who have a certain, like, moral and spiritual understanding of what they're doing, because they do believe that the inner world and the outer world are fundamentally the same, that the mind and the physical world are no different. So some things only work if you do them in a certain way that might not fit laboratory constructions. I mean, like, there are a lot of experiments that are like this. Like, it's really hard to, like, study people who are in the middle of falling in love, right? Because you can do the same physical things to them, but the spirit doesn't move. So I would pick up something about the history of alchemy and science. I would pick up Passport to Magonia by Jacques Vallée. Is a lot of fun. Just read it for fun.
Yeah. It just got reissued, I think, only in the last maybe year.
Oh, cool. I need to pick that up. Let me look at my bookshelf. I didn't expect this question. And two other books that I really love are the first, which I just recently read and thought was fantastic, is Erwin Schrödinger's book, My View of the World. Schrödinger was, Schrödinger's cat fame. He's a physicist, but he was also a fantastic philosopher. And in this, he articulates a kind of vision of the world and where mind is primary rather than matter. And he does it very clearly. And the next thing I would pick up, the last thing, is the novel that changed my life by John Fowles, called The Magus. I buy every copy of this book that I can find that was printed before 1977, because it's not a print, and the pre-77 edition is the good one.
Wow.
To get changed before that. But it's the philosophically most insightful novel I've ever read. It gets you thinking about things that really matter, and it's beautifully written and intense. So those are my books. I would read fiction. My advice would read all those books, but always be reading fiction, because a lot of the really good thinking about the things that matter just aren't being done in nonfiction right now. They're being done by people who consider themselves fiction authors, but that's who we're going to need to think about things that we haven't encountered yet. That's just fiction by definition, I think.
Yeah, it's interesting. It has that free space to explore, and maybe that's one of the reasons Arrival is so great, because Ted Chiang is playing in fiction land, and I've recommended him strongly before, but I would just...
He's a fantastic thinker. I mean, he's a good writer, but like, he's a philosopher and kind of a philosopher of science who's just thinking about this stuff imaginatively, and it's as important as any paper you're going to read those people.
Okay, so third and final, I'm curious what you think about public contact. And you might be able to help me formulate this question, because I'm still working it out and thinking about it a little bit. But where my starting point is, government's moving slowly on this. Military and intelligence communities are dragging their heels. Scientific communities just kind of getting warmed up, getting their feet wet. We're starting to learn stuff. But it might still be a long time before we get a satisfying piece of information about the subject. And as you pointed out, disclosure might still come with a bunch of question marks and not even really be the main thing we should think about. So one question that I've been entertaining is, what should public contact look like if we do it in a way that isn't led by our military and intelligence agencies? And I just wanted to bounce it off you and see if you have any instincts or intuitions about that, or if you have a better framing of this question. I would be interested in your take on that too.
So it presumes that public contact is something we would initiate. How would that work? Like, it's not really up to us, is it?
Right. Yeah. The question one of the project would be, is it possible? Is this CE5 stuff that they do in the desert where they summon orbs, is that real? Is there anything to it? And then maybe question two would be, how would we attempt to communicate? And question three would be, what would we say? And so maybe that is the place to ask a good question of a fellow human being. What would you like to say if it were possible and we could try to communicate?
I think that I'm skeptical of the CE5 stuff, because so many people have to pay to do it with the people who are teaching it. And I think if you knew how to contact higher intelligences, I would think that you would find that so significant for your fellow humans that you would think it was undignified to sell it and make it only available to people who had the economic means to pay you for it. That seems about the same as telling people you know how to pray to God, but only if they'll give you money. So whether it's real or not, whether there's evidence for those people or not, I think there's enough poison in that tree for me to say I'm just not comfortable eating the fruit of any of it.
Yeah, for the record, I have no read on that one way or the other myself. Sure. I don't know, and I don't have any insight.
Sure. I just know that there are people who've developed these protocols and who are using it for profit, and that seems so unusual to me.
Yeah.
But the Russians seemed to have believed that they could summon these things. There's documents from the USSR about some, getting them to come down and using colored lights and things to signal them. And
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's at the same time that the Russians were doing all this psychic spying stuff. There's a book called The Russian Cosmists, maybe. I think it's by Gregory. I can't remember his name. Just look up The Russian Cosmists. I think that's the book where this stuff gets mentioned. But what would I want to say to him? Honestly, I would want physical contact. I wouldn't want language to be the thing, because I would have no faith that we could say anything that could come across, and anything that did might get garbled so badly that it didn't even matter.
I would offer weapon.
Yeah. I would want it to be like a ritual, a sort of symbolic kind of thing that communicated in a deeper way, maybe laying down weapons and meeting them, naked or something, to try to communicate. And that's in those sorts of like very basic symbolic language of the body and food and war and stuff like that. So I would want it to be something that goes beyond language, but that would look freaky to people who want to interpret it as like a satanic ritual or something. I'm sure people would think that, but it's hard to say anything clearly that can't be misinterpreted. So, yeah. And what was the other part of the question? How to initiate it? Stephen Brown.
I just want to quickly pause and say, I think that's great, man. I think it's really beautiful, and I like the idea, and it sounds fun for everyone.
I mean, I like it, but I'm volunteering too. I mean, if anybody needs the person to like go nakedly confront an ET, I'm
Bring
probably
some food and a gun to put down.
Yeah. But Stephen Brown has this really interesting argument where he says that basically we are observing something like the Star Trek
First
non-interference
contact.
protocol. What's the
protocol is the I don't know, the non-engagement protocols.
The prime directive.
There it is.
He argues that what we're seeing is something like the prime directive on the part of these other beings.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a weak prime directive, like you see in Star Trek. Like they prefer benevolent non-interference unless it's absolutely necessary to like to save the planet or something.
But we'll still make love with a bunch of you if you're down.
Right. Not the Kirk prime directive, because he doesn't care about the prime directive. But if that's the case, then I pointed this out to him at Yale, is that it has a really bizarre consequence that you can initiate open first contact whenever you want. All you have to do is build a doomsday machine that will certainly destroy all of Earth with a countdown on it, and just press the button and make sure that they know you can't stop it.
Oh man.
Then if they're inclined to save the Earth regardless of the prime directive rule, then you've trapped them. So depending on how
I like the naked picnic party idea better.
Yeah, me too. But it's another option, tricking them into saving us and revealing themselves.
Good to have that in our back pocket. Well, extremely creative of you, sir, and thank you so much for spending this time with me. It's been really nice getting to know you.
A lot of fun, yeah.
So maybe in a year or two, as things move down the road, we can reconnect and compare notes, if that sounds good to you.
I would love that. I would love it. Anytime.
Okay, great. Well, meanwhile, where should people follow you online and admire your work?
You can check out the Anomalous review on any podcast platform that you use. If you can't find it on there, just email me and I'll make sure it gets up there. If you want to talk to me, I'm Michael Glawson at me.com. I'm on Twitter at Michael Glawson. I do some things with SCU. Look out for what SCU does. Join SCU. Throw us some money. We're a nonprofit. We do good job. That's about it.
Cool, man. And are you like in the business of looking for more philosophy work right now, or are you happy with your pursuit?
It's not much of a business. Not much of a business out there for philosophers. No, I'm on leave from teaching, but if you want to hire me as a consultant for anything related to this subject or anything else, I'm happy to be paid for thinking. That's kind of the dream.
That's great. Hire this man. If you're listening out there and you're done throwing a bunch of money at Kevin Knuth's sensor arrays,
Yeah, they're cheap. He makes them, so you got to trust
right. Him. So you'll have plenty left over for Dr. Glawson's consultancy services. All right. Well, thank you so much, man. I look forward to speaking with you again in the future. Appreciate your time today.
It was great, man. Thank you.